In the 1960s, civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and future Congressman John Lewis, along with thousands of other men and women, both black and white, trained each other in the ways of nonviolent direct action. This method of peaceful protest included sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom rides on bus lines, and marches all over the nation. But to participate, you couldn't just show up at many of these events. The organizers required hours of training for people to participate in these nonviolent direct actions. First, participants had to be trained on how to remain calm, on how to endure what might be done to them in response to their actions. And they would role play these things. They would role play how to deal with being arrested, how to prepare for it, how to cope with it. They would role play how to be calm in the face of verbal or even physical abuse. They would have a practice lunch counter sit-in, and other students would train students by pouring drinks on them and shouting at them to help them practice what it might feel like in response to deal with people's reactions. Because the most natural response to injustice and abuse is anger. So these students trained each other and practiced what they might go through so that they wouldn't react with anger and perhaps escalate the violence. They had to experience a tiny taste of what they might face so that when it really happened in these hostile environments, they could stay calm and keep the nonviolent tenets. Demonstrators suffered this abuse with humility and without retaliation, and their peaceful response to the abuse made it even more shocking to witness what was being done to them in newspaper articles and on TV. It made those perpetrators look even worse because the people they were shouting at or attacking were not fighting back. Witnessing these things helped change people's hearts and minds about segregation and many other injustices. And embedded with these practices of nonviolence is a deep sense of humility. The movement had great leaders like Dr. King and the future Congressman John Lewis, Rosa Parks, so many others. But the real power was in the thousands of other nameless folks who showed up to sit-ins and marches and rode buses on freedom rides and kept the movement going. Thousands of marchers, foot soldiers, individuals willing to give up some of their own individual power and autonomy, willing to suffer so that many people could gain civil rights. The leaders of this movement often faced terrible suffering and reaction from the crowds. We all know what happened to Dr. King in Memphis. And even before that, he was stabbed by a woman with a letter opener on the street, which I did not know until my trip a couple weeks ago. He was walking along the street and a woman came up to him and said, "Are you Dr. King?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." And she took a letter opener out of her purse and stabbed him in the chest with it. And they told him that it was so close to his heart that if he had sneezed, he would have died. So if you listen to his final speech that he gave in Memphis, he talks about that. If I had sneezed, I'm so glad I didn't sneeze. Congressman Lewis was just in his early 20s when he led the marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. He was first in line. He had his backpack. It had a change of clothes in it, toothbrush, an apple, because they were going to march all the way to Montgomery. But when they crested the bridge, They saw a line of Alabama state troopers waiting on them. And you might think, well, John Lewis, he was at the front of the line. It's a place of honor. It meant he was the first one to get knocked down, almost trampled, hit in the head with a nightstick. He had a fractured skull and had to be carried off unconscious to safety. Leaders like these two men following this way of nonviolence, a way of nonviolence which, by the way, was taught by Jesus Christ and later used by Gandhi, often paid a high price in their own blood, which is what makes it so ridiculous that James and John have come to Jesus and said, "Teacher, do for us whatever we ask. Let us sit at your right hand and your left in your glory." Along with Peter, James and John are part of Jesus' inner circle, his three closest confidants, so maybe they felt entitled to ask for this place of honor. But Jesus responds, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink?" And that's an idiom for, are you able to suffer my fate, the fate that I'm going to suffer? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? And I have to imagine that Jesus, who loves his disciples dearly and knows a little bit about what his own fate will be, wants to spare them that suffering. You don't know what you are asking to be at my right hand or my left. And yet I also imagine that Jesus may have felt a little disappointed in his friends, in his students. He has literally just finished teaching them in the previous lesson, many who are last will be first, and the first will be last. And it appears to have gone in one ear and out the other, because their response is, let us be at the front of the line. Let us sit closest to you. They look at Jesus and see this is where the power is, and so we want to be closest to it. And I just imagine him throwing up his hands. Did you hear nothing I said? With Jesus, there's always a great reversal. Many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first must be a slave to all. James, John, you don't know what you are asking. Mark's gospel was probably the first one to be written, and one of the themes in Mark's gospel is the general incompetence of the disciples. In fact, that is why, one of the reasons why scholars think it was the first to be written. Because the next gospels, Matthew and Luke, sort of cleaned things up and made the disciples look a little smarter and not so foolish. Even still, in all of the Gospels, one thing that these disciples, God loved them, continued to do was try to seek power, or try to push Jesus to seek more power for himself. Because they were an oppressed people living under the Roman Empire, and Roman-appointed governors controlled so many aspects of their lives. The Jewish people yearned for their freedom. They thought back to Moses leading their ancestors out of Egypt, and they thought, maybe Jesus will be the one to lead us out of this state of oppression. And they thought, the only way to do this is to fight, to rebel against Rome, to be victorious over our enemies. And they are continually frustrated because Jesus taught a different way. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so, what might we learn 2,000 years after Jesus said these words, and 60 years since segregation was ended by the Civil Rights Act of 1964? What can we learn from the way of nonviolence, the way of love? Especially as our own nation is once again feeling the tension of an approaching election that feels momentous. What can we learn from the great leaders who went before us as election day comes closer? I'm sure much could be said, but I'm focused on two things. Two things that I hope you carry with you as you leave today. Lesson number 1, do not seek to be served, but to serve. Do not seek to cling to power, but rather to empower others. Again, we are followers of Jesus, and Jesus teaches us again and again that a great reversal is coming. God's kingdom will bring a flip-flop. The first will be last. True power is not in domination, but devotion. Lesson number 2, probably the hardest that Jesus ever taught. Any guesses? Love your enemies. Probably his toughest lesson to us. Jesus taught this lesson in the Sermon on the Mount, and later Dr. King and other civil rights leaders taught it when they trained people in nonviolent direct action. They would teach the principles of nonviolence, and one of which was that there's a belief in Dr. King's principles of nonviolence that evildoers were also victims of a corrupt system. So the people shouting at them and pouring drinks on them at lunch counters were also victims of this mindset of prejudice. Dr. King also taught that love for our enemies is how we demonstrate love for ourselves. If you find it hard to think of people as evildoers or your enemies, many of us don't go around making tons of enemies, but we do have people in our lives with whom we disagree passionately on important issues. And the lesson here is to see their humanity, not to lump them into a box. To look at them and see a precious child of God. See and value the humanity in the people with whom you disagree. In fact, we promise this in our baptism when we are asked, will you seek to serve Christ in all people, loving your neighbor, and we might say loving your enemy as yourself? And it's hard. It has not come naturally to me. I have to work at it. I have to practice. I have to look at people on TV with whom I passionately disagree and focus on their face and remind myself this is a beloved child of God, even though I cannot stand a word they are saying. So it's hard. We might say to Jesus, Jesus, you don't know what you are asking of us. But he does. He knows very well how hard it is. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so we ask for his help. In fact, when we are asked that question, when we get baptized and when we remember our vows, what is the answer? Will you seek to serve Christ in all people, loving your neighbor as yourself? And we respond, I will, with God's help. May it be so. Amen.